Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Carlow College lecture series for Politics and Society. My name is Steph Hanlon. I'm a lecturer in Social, Political and Community Studies in Carlow College. And today I'm going to be talking to you about two key thinkers on the Politics and Society syllabus, and those are Benedict Anderson and Edward Said. In particular, we're going to be looking at the two key theories of those thinkers, and Nationalism and Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson and Orientalism by Edward Said. So, first things first, this lecture is broken up into three parts. So the first part, we're going to look at Benedict Anderson and his concept of imagined communities. And we're going to look at how we can apply imagined communities in the context of a political speech. So specifically, we're going to focus on a speech that was delivered by Keir Starmer, titled The Island of Strangers speech. The second part, we explore the work of Edward Said. In particular, we focus on Orientalism, and we're going to apply that to another case study. In this, we're going to look at Orientalist representations in culture. So particularly, we're going to do a whistle-stop tour of art, of film, and of media. And then the last part, we're going to draw on Benedict Anderson's work around nationalism and Edward Said's work in Orientalism when he talks about the Orient as something that is constructed as the other. And we're going to look at how we can identify patterns of othering in media coverage. Okay, so explicitly, we're going to look at contemporary news coverage and the differential treatment of Ukrainian and Syrian refugees. So we're going to really take a practical focus of this. So, I think in terms of engaging with these thinkers, we're not just going to define their theories. The focus today is on application and how you can use these theories and these thinkers to analyze political speeches, to analyze media coverage, to engage with film and cultural representation, and to look at language that's used around refugees and immigration. Okay, so by the end of the lecture, hopefully, you'll be able to explain Anderson's theory of imagined communities. You will be able to apply Anderson's theory to a political speech. And from then, you'll be able to explain Edward Said's theory of Orientalism. And we will explore Orientalist representations in visual culture. And lastly, you will be able to recognize and analyze processes of othering in media coverage. So, like I said, the core focus is practical application. And hopefully this will help in you kind of building your skills for when you are demonstrating your knowledge, but also demonstrating your ability to critically analyze in the exam. So, first things first, Benedict Anderson and his work, Imagined Communities. So, Benedict Anderson is an interesting character. He seems to, in many cases, have led a life that was designed to produce a theory of nationalism. And I think in terms of politics and society, it is very important that we always look at the background context and the life of the thinker themselves, because they can do a good job of shining a light into why key theorists, come up with the ideas that they do. Because, everything is shaped by a political, an economic, and a social context. So, for example, for Anderson, he was born in Kunming, China. His father was Irish and his mother was English, and his early life was shaped by global conflict. So his family fled to California during World War II, and he studied in the United States and then later at Cambridge, but he never really belonged neatly to one particular nation. Actually, in an interview once, he described himself as having a detached relationship to nationalism. So something that he kind of considered he was never fully immersed in one singular national identity. And this is why this matters, because unlike scholars who studied nationalism from within a very strong, singular patriotic tradition, Anderson experienced identity as something that was mobile, that was shifting, and that was layered. And he saw firsthand how people could feel deep loyalty to places that they'd never fully known in any personal sense. So his academic career, unlike a lot of other theorists of nationalism, it didn't focus on Europe alone. Actually, he specialized in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Indonesia. So moving on, these experiences, they famously shaped his most famous insight in imagined communities. And that is that nations are not ancient natural identities or entities. They are cultural constructions. So people feel profound attachment to fellow citizens that they will never meet. The nation exists because it is imagined into being through language, through print media, through shared rituals, and through education. So Anderson didn't argue, importantly, that nations are fake. Instead, he showed that the power of nations comes precisely from how they are imagined. So their imagined nature. For himself, having lived across political systems, having lived across continents, he understood that belonging is both deeply emotional and it's also socially constructed. I mean, his own transnational life made him very uniquely positioned to see nationalism not as a destiny, but as a story that people collectively learn to tell about themselves. So, Anderson identifies three paradoxes of nationalism. And I have them layered out here. The first paradox is that nations are historically recent. However, people believe that their nation has existed forever. So that is what we call the historical paradox. Okay, so that highlights that, yes, nations are objectively modern constructs, but people, create this disconnect between historical fact and national myth. So that's paradox one. Paradox two is a sociological paradox. So that notes that almost everyone belongs to a nation, yet every nation claims to be special and different. So basically what that means is that he identifies that nationality is a universal attribute for individuals. However, each nation asserts its own unique particularity, claiming distinctiveness. And lastly, we have paradox three, and that can be referred to as the political paradox. So that really talks about the immense political power and influence of nationalism as a force, despite what he refers to as its philosophical poverty and internal contradictions. So in this case, he notes, there is no great philosopher, like in the case of liberalism, where we have John Locke, or Marxism, where we have Karl Marx. So he aims to kind of highlight that these paradoxes help us understand why nationalism feels so natural, even though it is a social creation. So in sum, we can see here, nationalism is modern, but it feels ancient. Nationalism is universal, but every nation is unique. And then lastly, nationalism is powerful. However, it has no clear intellectual origin. So the 2024 European elections show that nationalism remains politically powerful and appealing as a political tool. So we can see this in the rise in nationalist populism. Okay, so despite each of the paradoxes that Anderson identifies, the European Parliament elections in June they kind of, tell a very particular picture. And essentially, we can see far-right parties secured 189 seats in the parliament, and that's just over a quarter of all seats. Okay. However, it is important to note that the centre-right European People's Party remained the largest group, and the Social Democrats remained the second largest. Okay. At the same time, there were large groups showing significant gains, those being the European Conservatives and Reformists, and also the Patriots for Europe. Okay. And why am I referring to this? Well, many of these parties have a commonality. So there's a strong nationalist rhetoric. There are anti-European policies or anti-EU positions. There are anti-immigration positions. There are anti-establishment narratives. And there's a strong emphasis on national sovereignty. So this kind of fits with the broader trend of nationalist resurgence. So we're going to move now from this rise in nationalist politics to the notion of othering, because othering is a key process in nationalist rhetoric. Nationalism focuses on building solidarity within a group. So again, building that imagined community that Benedict Anderson talks about. Okay, we are tapping into the imagination of the people within this given nation. However, in order to build solidarity, we need to focus on who is inside or who is seen to be inside the nation. What that means then is also looking at who we conceive to be outside the nation. So what that means is defining an outsider and fundamentally creating boundaries between us and them. So if we look at nationalism in the context of a very narrow interpretation, that could involve kind of portraying and framing another group as fundamentally different, as outsiders. And that can tie into kind of more negative portrayals, so portraying them as threatening or less rational, but also defining who belongs and who doesn't. So in this case, nationalist populist rhetoric can often frame migrants as threats or minority groups as outsiders, and can focus heavily on border control and cultural tensions. So in this case, it can unintentionally, as well as intentionally, reinforce narratives of othering. So how can we look at how this manifests in practice? Okay. Particularly, we're going to look now at a speech that was delivered in May as part of the white paper on immigration by Keir Starmer of the Labour Party. Okay, so Keir Starmer delivered a speech in which he warned that the UK risks becoming an island of strangers. And in this case, the white paper press conference, that created quite a bit of backlash for his speech's similarity to a very famous speech by Enoch Powell titled his Rivers of Blood speech, which is seen as very contentious and very controversial by playing into racist exclusionary tropes. So to take a quote, to take an excerpt from Keir Starmer's speech, which is available at the link there, and it's available online. The speech goes, nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not. But either way, they give shape to our values. They guide us towards our rights, of course, but also our responsibilities, the obligations we owe to one another. Now, in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. So I have highlighted in bold points that I'm going to zone in on in the next slide. Okay, and this is kind of how we can identify these patterns of othering. Okay, so when we look at analyzing political language, okay, this section from the speech reflects what can be referred to as a civic nationalist framing. So basically, a framing of the nation with reference to civic duties. Okay, so duties of the rules, duties for citizens, of rules and of fairness. Okay, however, the use of this metaphor of strangers, that activates ethno-nationalist undertones. Okay, so this kind of reference of strangers as well as our kind of creates this in-group and out-group identity. So on one hand, we have the our, so us, and then on the other one, we have strangers, so we have them. So if you see the pieces that the sentences and the words that I had underlined in bold, I've brought them in here, okay, to this slide. So in this case, the nation is constructed as a moral community. Okay, so that's how it's imagined, and we see a reference to our values. The nation is constructed as a place of shared obligations, and then we have in brackets where Keir Starmer refers to the obligations we owe to one another. And then also kind of this notion of the nation as moving forward together. Okay, and we have a nation that walks forward together. Okay, so this kind of reinforces this idea of this kind of imagined national community bound by norms and responsibilities and moving forward together towards progress. Now, towards the end of the excerpt, the phrase island of strangers implies, this kind of threat, this threat of a loss of shared identity should we continue the path that we're going. It also can imply a fragmentation of belonging, and it can also kind of imply a shift from community to alienation. So in this case, we're kind of looking at, insiders and outsiders. So this speech is kind of laden with symbolic boundaries between us, ourselves, and newcomers, that risk that Keir Starmer refers to. We run the risk of becoming an island of strangers. So we're seeing a positive framing of the nation, a positive imagining of the nation, but again, a nation that is at risk if we continue down the path that we are going. Okay, so that's us looking at Anderson and imagined communities, and then applying that in the context of a political speech by Keir Starmer. And our next part, we're going to be talking about Edward Said and Orientalism. Okay, so we're going to be looking, like we did with Benedict Anderson, we're going to be giving some background to Edward Said, and from there we're going to look at how he developed the theory of Orientalism. So Edward Said, like with Benedict Anderson, there is a continuing theme of identity and belonging. So despite the two of them having very different kind of backgrounds and having different theories, we see a common thread running through both of them. So Edward Said too, he lived a life defined by displacement, and that experience, as with Benedict Anderson, that really shaped his ideas around culture and power and representation. So Said was Palestinian and he was Christian, and he was raised in a middle-class background in a well-off, culturally cosmopolitan family. He was born in 1935 in Jerusalem, and he spent a lot of time in his youth in Lebanon and in Jerusalem until the Nakba in 1948. and he was educated in elite British and American institutions. And Said actually wrote a memoir in 1999. His memoir was called Out of Place. And this kind of, it's a really beautifully written book where he names this condition of, feeling exiled, and basically a way of being in a world defined by vigilance and this enduring sense of not quite belonging anywhere. Again, something that we see that's kind of similar to Benedict Anderson. So this kind of sensibility we can recognize as quite foundational to his key work, and his key work being Orientalism. So that's now recognized as a foundational text in post-colonial studies. And then we have another one of his book. Now, he wrote 22 books in total, but another book being The Question of Palestine, which was published a year later. And then a good bit later on, his book, Culture and Imperialism. So, just, his own personal experience of seeing his culture stereotyped and politicized led to this groundbreaking work in Orientalism. And, his life as a Palestinian intellectual in the United States of America also meant that he witnessed how much media narratives did shape public opinion. So particularly at the time in relation to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he understood that the struggle was not just about territory, it was also symbolic. It was about who gets to define reality. So who is right, who is moral. And just as Benedict Anderson's, personal life shaped his understanding of nationalism, Edward Said's experience of displacement and misrepresentation shaped his understanding of Orientalism. For him, ideas weren't, in abstract. They were tied to lived experience. They were tied to inequality and political power structures. So his work kind of, provides a very unique insight into how cultures are represented in the media, in the literature, and in politics, and how these have real world consequences. So now, how can we look at his theory of Orientalism? So some of his kind of hallmark, characteristics of Orientalism are this binary between the West and the East. Okay, so he argues that in Western thought, the world is divided into the Occident, which is referred to the West, and the Orient, which he refers to as the East, and that Orientalism acts as a system. Okay, so as an entire system of representation. So it's not simply down to individual ideas, it's a whole way and a lens of viewing the world. So this is, once you kind of put on these kind of, I suppose, theoretical, if you look at it through this theoretical lens, it's like putting on glasses, and you can see Orientalist representations in literature, in academic writing, political speeches, media coverage, and so on and so forth. But for him, this system of representation all came together to shape how societies understand what is considered as the East. And then particularly, this East is constructed as the other. So something that is fundamentally different, that is threatening, that is culturally inferior. And this process reinforces Western identity and Western superiority. And importantly, he argued that the identity of the West as superior depends partly on defining what it is not. So in order to be in a position, a self-representation of being superior, it has to identify what it considers to be inferior. So this was important because this provided a very important justification for imperialism. So by portraying the Orient as backward or as incapable of self-rule, imperial intervention could then be justified. colonization was framed as modernizing or civilizing, and Western domination was presented as necessary. So Orientalist discourse, or should we say the set of language and, ways of talking about the Orient, that made imperialism and empire seem morally acceptable, and it made it seem legitimate. So there's two quotes from Said on the other. From Orientalism, he says, "The Orient is transformed from a far distant and often threatening otherness into figures that are relatively familiar." And in a more recent interview in 2001, he says, well, the study of the other has a lot to do with control and dominance of Europe and the West generally in the Islamic world. And it has persisted because it's based very, very deeply in religious roots, where Islam is seen as a kind of competitor of Christianity. So that's how he refers to othering. Okay, so this is really important because what we're referring to is the ways that representation become forms of power, and how when we're studying in politics and society, we can understand that representation and the use of language, these are expressions of power. So how can we see these? Well, we're going to look at how this happens again in practice. Okay, so first we're going to look at visual images. So we're going to look at art, we are going to look at film, and we are going to just have a kind of a brief overview of that. So this first painting is referred to, it's named "The Women of Algiers" by Eugene Delacroix. And Orientalism in visual art is often used as an example of how the Orient is represented. So in the 19th century, a number of European artists became absolutely fascinated with what they called the Orient. And that broadly referred to a number of very, very different areas that had a tendency to be just lumped together. So the Middle East, parts of Asia, and North Africa particularly. One of the most famous Orientalist painters was a French Romantic painter called Eugene Delacroix, whose work is here. And you'll see some more of his paintings in the following slides. But Delacroix, he traveled to Morocco and in Algeria in 1832, shortly after France began its colonial occupation of Algeria. And his paintings, like this one, "The Women of Algiers," and you're gonna see another one, "The Death of Sardanapalus." They depicted very richly colored, interiors, veiled women, crowded marketplaces, dramatic scenes of violence and sensuality. These works were celebrated in Europe for their exotic detail, for their emotional intensity, and the creation of kind of mystery. And they're considered as Oriental because they represent the East, not as a complex or modern society, but more as timeless, and these are the features of the Orient, but as timeless, as sensual, as violent, as mysterious and decadent. So if you want to look at some of the features of Orientalist representations, this is just some of a few to name. So, a generic place. So like I mentioned, we have the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Asia, all kind of being tied in together and represented all as the Orient, okay, despite vast differences in absolutely everything from religion, symbolism, culture, traditions, and so on and so forth. And of course, it is marked by racial and sexual stereotypes. So moving on to that notion. So we have here first the negative depiction, but we also have the depiction of the Orient as timeless. So for example, we can see here there are three images, and this shows the Orient as timeless and without a place. So for example, when we talk about depicting the Orient as timeless and without a place, what I mean with that is that, you know, these films often detach Middle Eastern societies, or, you know, Asian or North African societies from kind of modern history. In this case, you know, portraying them as frozen in an ancient past. So the first picture on top, the large picture, is taken from Aladdin. And in Aladdin, we have the fictional city of Agrabah, and that exists in this kind of vague, you know, a vague space without history, okay? Where medieval architecture, magic, deserts, and bazaars merge into this kind of fantasy world that's disconnected from contemporary global reality. And this kind of reinforces the idea that the Orient exists outside modern progress. And also, you know, the Orient, you can see from the bottom two pictures, becomes a generic place rather than a specific country. So cultural details are blended together so that, you know, Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, all seem like places that could be considered as interchangeable. So you might not be able to identify one from the other. So you have, like, in all of these pictures, you have, you know, deserts, camels, markets, you know, and minarets kind of often in the same picture, kind of providing this kind of visual shortcut for understanding, oh, this is the Orient. And what this does is it erases national difference. It erases strong differences in culture and identity, as well as, you know, actual periods of history. So we bring this further, we see this in Hollywood films. So Hollywood films like The Mummy, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, True Lies, in the bottom left-hand corner with Jamie Lee, as well as Disney's animated Aladdin. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be picking on Aladdin, it's just the first one that comes to mind. They also illustrate recurring Orientalist patterns. So to talk about how the Orient is portrayed negatively, it is depicted as dangerous, as unstable, as morally corrupt, in comparison to this neutral notion of this kind of neutral, liberal, democratic West. In The Mummy and in Indiana Jones, you know, Middle Eastern settings kind of serve as threatening backdrops filled with violence and treachery, while Western protagonists appear rational and heroic. But also, characters are also frequently shown as emotionally volatile or fanatical or bizarre. In True Lies, so again, the bottom left-hand corner, you have people who are terrorists but are caricatured as exaggerated villains, like over the top, which kind of reinforces this image of the Middle East as inherently unstable or, you know, extreme. And, you know, you often see kind of, you know, scenes where, you know, there's kind of markets that are shown as chaotic and lawless spaces, and authority figures are portrayed as incompetent or villainous. Even, and I have in the middle there a box with some text, even the first song in the opening of Aladdin, the film, the song Arabian Nights. It's a really good song, very catchy. But one of the first lines says, where it's flat and immense and the heat is intense, it's barbaric, but hey, it's home. So I would encourage you to have a listen to that song if you haven't heard it, or have a re-listen, because it's another really good example of when we put on this lens, or we look through, we look at film and media, and lots of different examples of culture, we can see how these political dynamics are very much there. So, lastly, I just want to mention, representations of women. So in this picture, in this frame, we have another portrait or another painting by Eugene Delacroix. We have on the left, we also have the belly dancers from Aladdin. But what we see is, kind of this depiction of our women who are often kind of exoticized dancers or submissive figures, and you often see that in kind of early imagery or the portrayal of women in adventure films that are set in the region. And you also see, Arab men, which are, often depicted as lazy or violent or greedy or tyrannical, and you often see these kind of depictions. If you look at the Mummy, if you look at the Indiana Jones films, they tend to kind of rely on that trope quite a lot. Okay, so moving swiftly on then, we're now in part 4. Okay, and we're going to look at how we can identify othering ourselves in news media coverage. So we've covered our theory, we've covered our examples. So now let's look at how you can go about analyzing this yourself. Okay. So this slide is quite detailed. I'm going to stay on it for a few minutes if you want to take a screenshot or anything. But here's kind of this 8-step approach that I often go through when we are analyzing media or news. To see if we can identify patterns of othering. Okay, so the 8 steps are structured around identify, look, examine, inspect, check, identify again, notice, and analyze. Okay, and I am definitely open to any suggestions for a catchier 8-step framework, because I don't have a very catchy title for this. So yeah, if you can think of anything, I'm very open to that. So basically, step 1, what are we doing? Well, we are identifying the groups that are being discussed. So who is being talked about in this article, okay, or in this news story, and who is doing the talking? Is there a clear we and they, or an us and a them? So it's kind of like we think about that speech by Keir Starmer that we looked at earlier. So have a look at highlighting pronouns. So in other words, words like we, our, they, or them. And the second thing is we look for boundary language. Okay, so we saw that again in the political speech by Keir Starmer. What are the symbolic boundaries that are created between groups? So for example, are the words insiders, outsiders mentioned? Words like strangers, like foreign, like our people, things like that. Okay, so what is it that the text suggests? Now, when I talk about, identifying words, these could be implicit or explicit. Okay, and the third thing there is we examine our adjectives and our descriptions. So what are our describing words? If one group is consistently described in a negative way, this can be an indication of othering. So what do we ask? Well, we ask what other words describe this group. Are the words positive or are the words negative? We would also ask, is there a pattern of positive or negative words? So which words, occur more often? The next one is to look for metaphors. Okay, so metaphors in particular, in context of othering, metaphors can be quite negative and they can even be dehumanizing. Okay, so that means just, using depersonalized metaphors. Okay, so in some cases, what you might have is you have water metaphors. If you're talking about referring to migration, you might, see articles describing people in terms of the word of flood, of waves. So like floods of migration or a wave of migration. Okay. So sometimes you can see it in the case of, people and phenomenon being described as natural disasters, or even more dehumanizing language like animals. Okay. And The next step we have, step 5, which is check for generalizations. Okay, so look for stereotypes, and look for kind of, whether groups are being blamed. So an entire group, is it being blamed for the actions of a few? Does the text use phrases like they always, or they all, or all of them? Okay. The next one for identify is where you try and identify problem framing. Okay, so is a group repeatedly framed as a problem or a threat? So is the group represented as an economic threat, so a threat to the economy, or a threat to culture, as we saw with Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers speech? Okay, we see an implicit reference to immigration being a threat to culture. Or are people referred to as a security threat? Okay, so a threat to national security. And then we have step 7, which is notice. Okay, so as well as looking at what is present, we also need to be very mindful about what is absent. Okay, so for example, if you're talking about groups, whose voices are included and whose voices are excluded. And this is very important if we're talking about, for example, minority groups. So are we referring to minority groups without platforming voices from that group? And we're mainly talking about people outside of that group. And are their perspectives represented, or are they only talked about? Okay, but from the outside. And our final step, analyze. Well, we're asking you to ask the key questions. So what are the critical questions? And that's really where we kind of get down to the roots of power dynamics. So who benefits from this representation? Okay, because othering often supports political or ideological goals. So does it strengthen this imagined national identity? Does it justify stricter policies? Does it seek to create fear or sow division? What are the aims and the objectives, the broader political aims and the objectives that are at play? So a big part of this is, what is the agenda? So you'll find that this kind of ties in quite a lot to media framing and agenda setting. So now, using this framework, okay, keeping this framework in mind, we're going to have a look at contrasting media coverage of the Syrian and the Ukrainian conflict, okay, to look at how this kind of can play out in practice, all right? And we're not going to go into a great amount of detail through each step. What we're going to do is look at evidence and research that is available that has undertaken very in-depth analysis of how the media has treated refugees from Syria and refugees from the Ukraine. So this is something that has been noted. The differential treatment in terms of reception conditions, in terms of legislation that has been in place, or policies that have been in place in terms of welcoming Ukrainian refugees or Syrian refugees. So this attention, this question, was raised by the Commission Chair, the UN Commission Chair for Syria, and who stated, there is an openness and generosity vis-a-vis the Ukraine, and I don't criticize at all. They deserve it, but I would very much like the same treatment to be applied to the Syrian refugees. So this is something that did kind of come on the agenda for a lot of people who have been working with asylum seekers and refugees, to look at, for people who are in dire straits, who are fleeing persecution and conflict, are there double standards, or why are there double standards? So attention is also highlighted to news anchors commenting and reporting on the Ukrainian conflict, and emphasizing, consistently cultural similarities to Europeans. And some of it was quite racist. And we see this article here, who talks about, the news coverage of Ukrainians and a sympathetic representation of Ukrainians as more deserving of, of being welcomed and being taken in. And that article is there. It's available on The Guardian, and there's lots of examples from different news anchors talking about how, Ukraine is so similar to us and we need to be more welcoming. It's not like as if it is the Middle East. Okay, so you're seeing very direct examples in that article. Okay, now this is a little table that I put together on some of the current research. So some of it is the latest research analyzing European and American media and news coverage of Syrian and of Ukrainian refugees. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we have the framing of Syrian refugees. So we have an article from 2017 that identifies negative frames. Okay, so it identifies 5 negative frames. So, well, 4 negative frames and 1 positive frame that was there, but not very dominant. So we see Syrian refugees in a cross-comparative analysis of 8 European countries. We see the frames of Syrian refugees in the context of terrorism, of economic crisis, antipathy towards Islam, towards moral deceit, and then this humanitarian frame, but it's not very active, not as active as the other frames. Then we also have an article from 2018, which identifies the framing of Syrian refugees as a security threat for Europe. And then another article from 2017, again, the framing of Syrian refugees as an economic burden. Okay. And then we look on the right-hand corner, or the right-hand column, and we see the research on the framing of Ukrainian refugees. And we see one article from 2022 that looks at the focus on geographical and cultural proximity. So we're so culturally similar, and we're so geographically similar. And then we see also another report by Riley and Flynn from 2022, and that identifies positive and welcoming narratives in the media. And then we see a very detailed article, which is available in the final slide. So the source is there, it's open access. So everything that is referenced here, all of these sources are included on the final slide, and all are open and available, so you can access them for free. They're not paywalled. And these are academic journals and reports. And, they're just good points to note if you kind of want to prepare something along these lines and you want some good evidence. These are some sources for you to use if you're compiling evidence to support arguments that you're looking to build. So this looks at a comparative analysis of framing in American media of Syrian refugees and of Ukrainian refugees. So the researchers found that there was a more sympathetic frame for European refugees than Syrian refugees, that Syrian refugees were more likely to be portrayed as threats, that Western officials were more likely asked, that's a typo, asked about the Syrian refugee crisis than in articles about the Ukrainian refugee crisis. And then we have that Syrian refugees were framed more as a political crisis framed than Ukrainian refugees. Okay, so in this case, Syria was, it's a Syrian refugee crisis, but we didn't really see the frame, the Ukrainian refugee crisis. So we're nearing the end of the lecture. So just a final recap, okay? The big difference, okay, is Benedict Anderson, in his work in Imagined Communities, Anderson explains how national identity is imagined, okay? However, Edward Said, he explains how the other, or the Orient, is constructed, okay? So they both have similarities, and they both speak to one another, okay? So if you are, preparing your key thinkers, they would be 2 good key thinkers, to prepare in tandem. All right. It's very hard to predict what's going to come up on the exam, but if you wanted to prepare a topic that ties them both in together, that would be something that you could do. So hopefully after this, you'll be able to define nationalism as an imagined community, and you'll be able to apply this theory to a political speech. You'll be able to define Orientalism and apply that to Orientalist representation in art and film, and analyze patterns of othering in media and political texts. And then lastly, just to be able to critically analyze the wider context of this in terms of contrasting representations of Syrian and Ukrainian refugees. Okay, so I am going to bring this onto the page of sources. So like I said, these are available. These are reports, or they are academic articles that are open access. Okay. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I hope this has been helpful. And in terms of politics and society, we're always happy to hear from people who have any questions or possibly prospective students. Okay.